I'm Jamila King, and welcome to this live special taping of the Mother Jones podcast. We are beaming this out Wednesday morning, the day after, on YouTube, Facebook, and Twitter. And of course, welcome in the flesh. So now we wait. If there was certainty going into election day, there would be massive uncertainty. This is the scenario I warned you about. No clear outcome on the last day of voting. It's a pagan, so this is a little confusing with the of mail-in ballots and early and absentee day of voting. So you'll have to for days, possibly weeks, depending on how counting and court battles play out. So let's try to make sense of this together. What happened in Florida? Voters trampled Biden's chances of a quick win. What happened in Miami? Where if some early hold true, votes are heading to a Biden victory. We told you here on this podcast it could happen. We'll take you there too. But first, get straight to David Korn, our Washington, D.C. bureau. David, what happened?
Well, what happened is, let's start with what didn't happen, okay? Because that's easier to describe. What didn't happen was there was not a landslide repudiation of Trump and his GOP enablers. That's what Democrats were looking for, clear victories, if not in a state like Florida, certainly in Wisconsin and Michigan, maybe one or two surprising pickups in a place like Georgia or North Carolina, and flipping the Senate at the same time to say that the Trump era is over. Trump is gone. We don't have to fight about it. And Republicans, you will pay for the last 4 years of your handmaidenship with Donald Trump. That did not happen. Donald Trump survived, at this point, seems to have survived some of the earlier challenges in Florida, maybe in Georgia, that's still out in North Carolina. And we went up to the states that people focused on, which was Wisconsin, Michigan, and Pennsylvania. And no surprise, we are waiting. We are waiting this point for full vote counts. Right now, as we're talking, Biden looks like he's in a decent position, in a better position than Trump by the numbers. But votes have to be counted, and there will no doubt be legal challenges, demands possibly for recounts, and court cases. This, could possibly go on for several more days, if not longer. Pennsylvania will probably take the longest to come in. If Biden wins decisively there, that may close the door to other fighting. But we also have Arizona, which was called by two networks, so by the AP and Fox, for Biden, but which would be one of the only non-Michigan, Wisconsin, Pennsylvania flips from last time in Trump's map. But the Trump campaign is pointing out that not all the votes have been counted there, and people are now being more cautious about that call. So, if you had a bet at this moment in time with the indicators that we have, you would say Biden squeaks by, and he's going to face a Mitch McConnell-led Republican Senate with a smaller Republican majority, but still a Republican majority. And God knows where that's going to lead us as a country, with, of course, Trump railing, as he began to earlier this morning, saying that the election was being stolen from him. And he essentially called for stopping the counting of mail-in ballots, which could have been counted before the election, but Republican legislatures in these key states passed laws so that they would not be counted until afterward. So he's out there playing the strongman, the authoritarian, undermining the election, demanding that counting be blocked, and he will continue to do that. So we are in a situation where numbers look good for Biden, but Trumpian chaos will color what happens today and in the coming days, which makes it hard to figure out what the outcome will be at the end of this. I think the technical terms for this is a mess. It's not clear. And to go back just to my original point, that if it ends up with Biden squeaking by, it's still rather notable, and I think for many Americans worrisome, that Donald Trump got more votes this time than he did 4 years ago. When people thought they could take a flyer on him, oh, who knows? I'll take a chance. How bad can he be? What do you have to lose, as he said? Well, after 4 years of watching him, and what have we lost? We've lost, almost 250,000 Americans because of his inept handling of the pandemic. Not all those deaths are his responsibility, but tens of thousands of them are. And so after 4 years of watching Trump behave in a racist, bigoted, authoritarian, crude, cruel, bigoted manner, and overseeing, the taking of lives of 230,000 of our fellow Americans, about half the electorate said, yeah, I want more of that. That is a profoundly troubling situation for this country to be in, that we're going to have to think long and hard about how to deal with once, the dust and the ballots have settled.
That's a really good point, David. Noah, what do you think was Trump's secret? And was it a secret?
I think it depends on what state you're talking about, but the one I can speak best to is Florida, where I was for a week in September in the Miami area reporting on how Cuban Americans were feeling about the election. And Florida did not really end up being particularly close with the results we have so far. Trump is ahead by about 3.5 points, and he did well and better than expected in many parts of the state, but his biggest gains by far were in Miami-Dade County, particularly among Cuban Americans. I mean, the numbers are really dramatic. In Hialeah, which is a majority, overwhelmingly Hispanic city, predominantly Cuban, he improved by about 33 points over 2016. That city was basically a tie in 2016 when Hillary Clinton ran. So it was really an awful night for Democrats in Miami-Dade County. They won by about 7 points in the county, and Clinton in 2016 won by 30 points. So that 23-point drop was devastating for them, but they also didn't do as well as expected in many other parts of the state. And then if you go up further to the Orlando area, Osceola County, which is heavily Puerto Rican, Biden also did worse there. So his problems with Hispanic voters spanned the state, and it was not just limited to Cuban Americans in the Miami area. And he did not improve as much among Anglo voters and other voters to make up for those losses. So in the end, it was not particularly close.
Fernanda Echavarri, you're our reporter in Tucson, Arizona. What's the latest there?
Well, I think David was talking about Arizona earlier, and the AP Fox, and also looking at the percentage of votes that have been counted. Biden has a lead, has kept a lead, and it's looking very likely that he's going to get Arizona, which has not gone to a Democrat more than once since 1948. So just Bill Clinton. And I think that this is, I was on a call earlier with a Latino activist, and I think that they're seeing this as a big win and a result of over a decade of organizing. I wrote about this for Mother Jones. This is not just something that happened out of the blue. This is not a surprise. This is a decade in the making. And I think it goes to show that seeing what an SB 1070, Joe Arpaio, Jan Brewer regime could do is something that Latinos in this state didn't want to do anymore. So they've been doing the work for a decade. Also, a fracture in the Republican Party. The Republican Party and John McCain in Arizona all really sort of just are all one. So to see Cindy McCain, John McCain's widow, not only endorse Joe Biden, but appear in ads and actively campaign for him, I think also had a lot to do with the results that we saw out of Maricopa County, the largest county that right now still is going for Biden.
If I can jump in here for a second.
Go ahead, David.
I love looking for the poetry in politics. And you might remember that when Donald Trump entered the race, really within the first week or so, he dissed John McCain.
Mm-hmm.
Said, "I don't like people who get shut down. I don't like losers and people who are taking POWs." And at the time, everyone said, "Oh, this shows that Trump can't win, and Republicans and people are going to hate him for this." I remember going on TV and saying, "I think this works for Trump with his base. His base, they don't like John McCain, and they like people acting like bullies." And indeed, it was not such a mistake. He didn't do it calculatingly, But once he made that statement, he doubled down on it, and his advisors around him thought it was good, that it helped him in the Republican primary. But now we go 4 years later, and we see the continuing insults that he threw at John McCain, particularly when John McCain died, and Sidney, he was not invited famously to the funeral, and so if indeed this race turns on Donald Trump's peak, that he hated John McCain so much, because in many ways John McCain was so much that he is not, from going to serving, to running away with bone spurs, to trying to be somewhat of a truth teller within the Republican Party. That wasn't what McCain always did, but he did to some degree, to Trump not being able to recognize the truth at any moment in time. If this is what brings him down, because he enraged Cindy McCain and enraged Arizona Republicans with his treatment of John McCain, it would be, as I go back to the word poetic, Shakespearean, rather appropriate. It's too bad that elections turn on such things, and the organizing work of the Latino community there that you mentioned, hats off to them. I mean, if they had not done that, whatever Trump said about McCain wouldn't have mattered, right? So you're right to hail their efforts, but still, this will be something at least to chuckle about if this leads to Trump's downfall.
So, David, I want to kind of harp on this McCain point a little bit. I can't help but think that Trump wouldn't be possible if McCain 2008, and specifically McCain Palin 2008, hadn't happened. What do you make of that? Like, is there anything to take away from that about how our politics have changed dramatically since that election?
Well, our politics have changed dramatically, but they haven't. It hasn't been a black to white transformation, right? I've written about this a lot over the last 4 years. The racism that's been at the heart of Trump's political project was something that the Republicans started embracing with Richard Nixon's 1968 Southern strategy, and through Ronald Reagan, campaigning at Philadelphia, Mississippi, this side of that horrific assassination of 3 civil rights workers, and George Bush the first running against Willie Horton. I mean, racism has been part of this, and then you had with John McCain, who we speak in venerable tones about now. And I knew him. I liked John, as much as we disagree on many things. But he chose Sarah Palin. And she was sort of the Tea Party queen, and was more a reality, even though she hadn't yet become a reality TV star. She was still more a reality TV star than a stateswoman at that point in time. And he put her on the ticket. John Boehner, they embodied the Tea Party movement. They thought that was the tiger they could ride to victory. Turns out the tiger overran each of them. And there's kind of a direct line from Sarah Palin to Donald Trump. So it's and who did the Democrats end up with? They ended up with Joe Biden, who was elected, in the 80s, who ran in 1988 for the first time for president. So, they maybe have a sine curve going back and forth, but, with the Republicans, it's just a straight descent into Trumpian hell, but, with relish. I mean, the base has become completely radicalized. A big portion of it buys the QAnon conspiracy nonsense. And if you look back, towards the end of Obama's presidency, about half of the Republicans polled said they believed in the racist birther conspiracy theory. So Republicans have been moving, over the past decades in a paranoid direction, in a racist direction. Not all Republicans, not all the time, but that's been a trend line. And then you end up with Trump. And so now we have a situation where Trump has radicalized, weaponized this gigantic base of people who accept, if not embrace, his paranoid notions, his own conspiracy theories, his racism, his cruelty, his crudeness, and that is a tremendous problem for us.
Fernanda, you've written before about not only the diversity of the Latino vote, but also the density of activism in Arizona, which is what you were just talking about a minute ago. It definitely looks like Biden tapped into that. Can you talk about that a little bit more? I mean, the organizing is one thing, but then, Biden being able to actually capitalize on that is another.
Yeah, I think there's something I wrote in the piece that I did about this for us that stuck with me, and that is, if you speak to a lot of the activists and the people who work for the voter outreach organizations here, they'll tell you that they're doing this work to protect their communities. That happens to align with the Democratic Party more than the Republican Party. But yes, they were working to get Biden elected, but they weren't necessarily super excited to work with the Democratic Party that they feel also has ignored them many times before, or will only come around when it's convenient. But I do think that Biden tapped into the networks that were already here, that were already set up. I think similarly with Mark Kelly, who also won the Senate race, or it's looking like most likely he's going to win the Senate race. And I think that national organizations that have people here in Arizona too, this was a grassroots effort in Arizona, but also the whole country was paying attention. We saw Phoenix had one of the hottest ad markets for many months in the summer. So there was a lot of interest in Arizona. And I think that if you think about this place being what was once sort of the epicenter of the Republican laws, the white leaders who were pushing anti-immigrant, anti-Mexican, anti-Latino laws, now the state is electing candidates like Mark Kelly and Joe Biden, who ran on pro-immigrant, pro-Latino campaigns. So I think that this really shows that there is, I guess, tapping into the networks that were already here is what's worked for Democratic candidates.
And Noah, I mean, it's cliche now, but obviously, the Latinx vote is not a monolith. Obviously, in Miami-Dade County, I'm hearing a lot of, obviously the Cuban American vote went largely for Trump. Maybe the same for Venezuelan American folks who, are casting a ballot against socialism. What are we seeing there? How do we make sense of that?
Yeah, no, I think what Fernanda said highlights how essential organizing is and paying attention and showing that you respect a community and are asking for their vote. Florida shows the perils of not doing that. I mean, the warning signs have been there for years. The Politico's postmortem of the 2018 election said Democrats have a Hispanic problem. Are they going to fix it before 2020, or are they going to let it fester and lose this election? And when I was in Miami in September, many South Florida Democrats said they basically let it fester. One said, we abandoned the battlefield. And in contrast to that, what they said is the Trump campaign basically took Obama's playbook from 2012 of being there all the time, organizing. It's silly to talk about, but you have the salsa song that became kind of a Trump anthem in Miami, but they showed up, and they showed up all the time. And so yes, they did particularly well with Cuban votes. I mean, may have won that vote by 40 points after Obama nearly tied it in 2012, but yet, like you said, it's also Venezuelans, Nicaraguans, Colombians, but then groups that traditionally go Democratic as well, like Puerto Ricans, appear to have moved towards Trump since 2016 as well. But I think what it really comes down to, and what local Democrats have been saying for years, is that you have to be there. You have to be organizing and asking people for their vote and explaining yourselves and rebutting the massive amounts of disinformation that Democrats have faced in Florida, where they're constantly called Cuban style, Venezuelan style communists. And those attacks have really stuck, particularly when they went unanswered for years.
I just want to add something here, if I can, really quickly, that this is why it's really important that candidates and campaigns understand the Latino community that they are trying to connect with in the place that they're trying to connect. Because I know, I've said this a million times already in the last decade, and that is that when you talk about the Latino vote, you can't talk about a Latino vote, because as Noah saw, the Cuban light-skinned person who is very Republican in Florida is not going to be aligned politically with an Afro-Latino Puerto Rican in New York. So, I mean, even just looking at that, Arizona is 90% of Mexican descent. It's a border state. There's a lot going on in the Latino community. So that's why it's important for for everybody when we're talking about the Latino vote, which vote in what state and what are we really talking about?
Let's talk finally about the other races as we wrap this up. David, how about the Senate? You kind of touched on it earlier, but where are we on that?
I haven't checked in the last few minutes, but there were a bunch of races that the Democrats, were hoping to pull off wins in, which they didn't. They did pick up a couple of seats that they needed, a net gain of 4. They lost Doug Jones down south. John Hickenlooper beat Cory Gardner in Colorado, but Steve Bullock did not beat Steve Daines in Montana. That seemed to be a very, good opportunity for the Democrats. So, there's still Mark Kelly, as Fernanda just mentioned, kind of cruised to victory. It looked like it was tight in the last polls, but he, pretty decisively won. And he, will become, an astronaut, husband of Gabby Giffords, somewhat of a celebrity senator. I've met him a couple of times, and I just, I have a thing for astronauts, so I was like a little political crush. But I'm very happy, after all they've gone through, the courage and persistence that they've shown as a family, I think is admirable. He'll be a great voice in the Senate. But there's still some votes, to count. Very, very, very outside chance that the Democrats will win the Senate. So you're looking at perhaps Joe Biden facing Mitch McConnell. But more importantly than just the Senate fight, the Democrats have lost a few seats in the House. I have conflicting reports on how many there are now. They're not going to lose control of the House, but their majority will go down. They didn't pick up seats, which they obviously were hoping to do. And that in some key states, I think North Carolina, I think Texas and others, down ballot races, the Democrats have performed poorly. A lot of talk about them, coming close to taking over the Texas state legislature. That's not happening. There's some very puzzling precincts and counties in the vote count in Texas that people will be looking at. But in a lot of these lower races, what's important is that they end up controlling districting of congressional districts, how they get cut up and gerrymandered. And if you control those, you can control the number of members of Congress you have in a state. And so the Democrats needed to gain back control of some of these state legislatures, and they're not going to do that. In a lot of places, they've headed in the other direction. So even if Biden ends up winning, and even the Democrats sort of shrug their shoulders about what happens in the Senate and the House, there's still a larger issue here for the Democratic Party, which is this, and it was completely unforeseen. It's not a wipeout, but an unforeseen drop in popular support for Democratic candidates writ large, up and down the ballot. Where that's coming from, and why Republicans, who were all associated fully with Trump, ended up, most of them, not paying for that. These are some powerful dynamics that have to be understood, particularly by Democrats and progressives, if they want to change the playing field.
So much left to learn. We will be watching and waiting. Thank you so much to my wonderful colleagues, David Korn, Fernanda Echavarri, and Noah Lanard. Thank you all for joining this live stream recording of the Mother Jones podcast. Thanks, guys.
Yeah, thank you, Jamil.
Thank you.
Thanks.
And if you're watching at home, please go to motherjones.com. Check out these folks' work. It's really, really important stuff. And that's it for this week's show. Thank you so much for tuning in. Again, if you want to support the Mother Jones podcast, it is easy to do. Just hit that subscribe button wherever you listen to your podcasts. And I'll see you next week.